Climate Summit here in Madrid, Spain. This is Democracy Now!
This process was designed to deliver global justice. This is a place where Tuvalu is as powerful as European Union or United States. But the constant bullying of these big countries are making this process worse than useless.
Despite the fact that President Trump is pulling the United States out of the Paris Climate Accord, we'll look at what the U.S. is doing while it's still here. Then, as two more indigenous activists are murdered in Brazil, we'll bring you the voices of protests at COP25.
Bolsonaro's government is threatening all of our lives are at risk right now. But that doesn't mean that we will stop fighting and fighting for the lives of our people.
Then we look at indigenous resistance in Canada and the United States. From the Dakota Access Pipeline to the Alberta tar sands, we'll speak with Canada's Indigenous Climate Action's Ariel Deranger.
We brought an Indigenous youth delegation that are impacted by tar sands infrastructure to the COP25 to promote and stand up for Indigenous people's rights.
And we look at the explosive Washington Post expose on the history of the U.S. war in Afghanistan. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from the UN Climate Summit in Madrid, Spain. Back in the United States, House Democratic lawmakers are expected to unveil articles of impeachment today, charging President Trump with abuse of power and conduct they say presents a clear and present danger to national security and the upcoming 2020 election. The New York Times reports the articles are expected to center on two charges: that Trump violated his oath of office by elevating his personal political concerns over the national interest, and that Trump stonewalled congressional attempts to investigate his actions. The ongoing impeachment inquiry centers on how Trump pressured the Ukrainian president to investigate Trump's political rival Joe Biden and his son Hunter. The New York Times reports the House Judiciary Committee was working overnight to prepare the articles of impeachment. This all comes after the House Judiciary Committee held a hearing Monday in which two lawyers argued evidence for and against impeachment. This is Republican lawyer Stephen Castor speaking about President Trump's July 25th phone call with the Ukrainian president.
The call summary reflects absolutely no pressure or conditionality. President Zelensky vocalized no concerns with the subject matters discussed. And there is no indication of bribery, extortion, or other illegal conduct on the call.
And this is Daniel Goldman, the House Intelligence Committee lawyer who led the Ukraine inquiry, testifying to the evidence for impeachment.
President Trump directed a months-long campaign to solicit foreign help in his 2020 re-election efforts, withholding official acts from the government of Ukraine in order to coerce and secure political assistance and interference in our domestic affairs. As part of this scheme, President Trump applied increasing pressure on the president of Ukraine to publicly announce two investigations helpful to his personal re-election efforts. He applied this pressure himself and through his agents, working within and outside of the U.S. government.
All this comes as the Justice Department's independent Inspector General, Michael Horowitz, released a long-awaited report that concludes the FBI acted without political bias when it opened the investigation into links between Trump's 2016 campaign and Russia. The report debunks Trump's often repeated claims that he was targeted by a politicized conspiracy. But the report did find serious and systematic problems with the FBI's wiretapping of former Trump campaign advisor Carter Page. The American Civil Liberties Union said, quote, the concerns the Inspector General identifies apply to intrusive investigations of others, including especially Muslims, and far better safeguards against abuse are necessary, unquote. The modern-day Pentagon Papers, that's how people are describing a confidential trove of documents obtained by the Washington Post, revealing how senior U.S. officials have lied throughout the 18-year U.S. war in Afghanistan, the longest war in U.S. history. The first installation of the explosive report, published Monday, is headlined "At War with the Truth." It documents how U.S. officials repeatedly lied about the war's progress while hiding evidence the war had become unwinnable. It also shows how 3 successive presidencies, President George W. Bush, President Obama, and President Trump, have bungled the war in Afghanistan, despite deploying 775,000 U.S. troops since 2001. More than 2,000 U.S. soldiers have died in Afghanistan, and 20,000 have been wounded. The papers also reveal how U.S. officials tried to hide the truth about the war from the American public. In one interview revealed in the papers, Douglas Lute, a 3-star Army general who served as the White House's Afghan war czar during both Bush and Obama administrations, said, quote, we were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing. If the American people knew the magnitude of this dysfunction, unquote. The 2,000 pages of secret documents contain 400 interviews with generals, diplomats, aid workers, Afghan officials, and others who played a direct role in the war. The Washington Post won access to the documents after a 3-year legal battle. The explosive Afghanistan papers come as Vermont Independent Senator Bernie Sanders and California Democratic Congressmember Rouhana are urging fellow lawmakers to vote against the $738 billion National Defense Authorization Act. In a joint statement, the 2 lawmakers said, quote, Congress should have used this National Defense Authorization Act to stop our endless wars. Instead, this bill does nothing to rein in out-of-control military spending, prevent unconstitutional war against Iran, limit the poisoning of Americans drinking water, or end the obscenity of innocent children in Yemen being killed by U.S. bombs, unquote. Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky met in Paris Monday and agreed to a full and comprehensive ceasefire in eastern Ukraine by the end of this year. The ceasefire aims to end 5.5 years of fighting that's killed at least 13,000 people. Russia and Ukraine agreed to release all conflict-related detainees by the end of the year and to resolve a dispute about Russian gas exports via pipelines that cross Ukraine. The 2 countries still disagree on the withdrawal of Russian-backed troops and elections in areas of Ukraine controlled by Russian-backed rebels. In India, protests have erupted across parts of the country as the lower house of parliament passed legislation that represents a major step in the official marginalization of India's 200 million Muslims. The Citizenship Amendment Bill would establish a religious test for people who wish to become citizens and provide a path to citizenship for all of South Asia's major religions except Islam. The legislation now heads to the upper house of parliament, where it's expected to pass. The bill is part of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Hindu nationalist agenda. Here in Madrid, Spain, protests continue as part of COP25, the UN climate summit. This morning, indigenous women protested outside the U.S. embassy to demand action to address the crisis of missing and murdered indigenous women and girls across North America. Madrid police shut down the protests within minutes. This is Muñeca de Oro from Guam.
I see that my struggle to protect my lands and waters from militarization and from the expansion of U.S. imperialism in my waters and in the whole region of Micronesia is very much connected to the violence and the assaults on the women across North and South America.
On Monday, indigenous climate leaders also gathered outside the Canadian embassy in Madrid to protest the Canadian government's support of the Alberta tar sands extraction and mine and pipeline infrastructure. This is Takaya Blaney of the Tla'amin Nation.
We're here to stand against destruction because it directly impacts us. Violence against the land is violence against indigenous people, and violence against the land is violence against future generations. So we're here to bring visibility to not just that desecration, but also bring visibility to indigenous climate defenders.
Also on Monday, Chilean activists gathered outside the COP25, the UN climate summit, to protest the right-wing government of President Sebastián Piñera and to denounce the summit being relocated to Madrid amidst massive anti-austerity protests in Chile. This is Chilean feminist activist Christine Engelbrecht.
Spain cannot welcome a murderous government because the government of Sebastián Piñera is murdering, it's wounding, and is purposely mutilating our people with the armed forces and the police. It's a deliberate attack. They perfectly know what they are doing. They're violating protocols. It has been confirmed by the Human Rights Watch that there are human rights violations and that the state is denying it. It's a state that negates what is happening. Protocols are not being followed and human rights are being violated in Chile.
The UN Climate Summit is being run by Chile, even though the Chilean government canceled it in Santiago amidst these massive anti-austerity protests there. And then the UN moved the COP to Madrid. And in yet another protest Monday, people walked out of a forum on carbon markets promoted by oil companies, including BP, Chevron, and Shell. The activists covered their ears and walked out as Shell Vice President Duncan Van Bergen began speaking. They later confronted him as he left the forum.
Are you willing to do what they're asking you to do?
Nobody's asked me anything.
Okay,
what's clear is that there is a need for
complete withdrawal from fossil fuels.
I think the dialogue is much more complex than that, but I would agree with everybody who says there's a need for absolute and urgent climate action.
Denmark has passed historic, legally binding climate legislation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 70% by 2030. Denmark's Climate Act also commits current and future climate ministers to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 at the latest. In Australia, at least 6 people have been killed and over 5 million acres have been scorched amidst Australia's worst fire season on record. At least 100 different fires are burning across the Australian states of New South Wales and Victoria. They're expected to worsen today as the temperature soars to above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, prompting some residents to flee their homes amidst the climate-fueled wildfires. In Iraq, the Committee to Protect Journalists is calling for the release of freelance journalist Zaid Mohammed al-Khafaji, who was abducted from his home in Baghdad on December 6 after covering anti-government protests in Tahrir Square. His abduction came the same day an unidentified gunman shot and killed photographer Abed Mahana Alami while he was covering protests in Baghdad. Security forces and militias have killed over 400 protesters since the massive anti-government demonstrations broke out across Iraq on October 1st. Burma's de facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi is arriving at the International Court of Justice at The Hague today, where she'll try to defend Burma against accusations the Burmese military has committed genocide against minority Rohingya Muslims. Gambia brought the genocide case to the International Court, accusing Burma of trying to, quote, destroy the Rohingya as a group in whole or in part by the use of mass murder, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, unquote. International aid groups say thousands of Rohingya have been murdered and 250,000 have been forced to flee into neighboring Bangladesh. This is Rohingya refugee Jamalita Begum speaking from Bangladesh.
3 military personnel raped me. They detained hundreds of our Rohingya women and raped them in front of their children and husbands. We have been demanding justice for all of this. Now we demand the trial for Aung San Suu Kyi in front of the world community.
Aung San Suu Kyi is a Nobel Peace Prize winner who spent years fighting against the Burmese military, which she is now defending at The Hague. The U.S. Supreme Court has refused to hear a challenge to a Kentucky law that requires doctors perform ultrasounds and show fetal images to patients before they can perform abortions. The refusal to hear the American Civil Liberties Union's appeal on behalf of Kentucky's only abortion clinic means the anti-abortion law remains in place. Pro-choice advocates argue the law has no medical basis whatsoever and that it's only aimed to coerce women into not having an abortion. In Houston, Texas, Police Chief Art Acevedo slammed Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and Texas Republican Senators John Cornyn and Ted Cruz for not reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act after a Houston police sergeant was killed while responding to a domestic violence call.
We all know in law enforcement that one of the biggest reasons that the Senate and Mitch McConnell and John Cornyn and Ted Cruz and others are not getting into a room and having a conference committee with the House and getting the Violence Against Women Act is because the NRA doesn't like the fact that we want to take firearms out of the hands of boyfriends that abuse their girlfriends. And who killed our sergeant? A boyfriend abusing his girlfriend.
Here in Spain, peace activists gathered at the Sagunto port in the region of Valencia early Tuesday morning to protest against the docking of a Saudi vessel that may be carrying weapons to be sent to Yemen. The vessel arrived in the port early this morning as a group of 7 activists rallied with signs that read, "Stop the war," and the war begins here. The war in Yemen has killed over 100,000 people and created the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Yes, we're broadcasting from inside the UN Climate Change Conference here in Madrid, Spain. That's the UN Climate Summit, where representatives from almost 200 countries have gathered to negotiate solutions to the climate crisis. The climate summit, known as COP25 for Conference of Parties over the last 25 years, offers a rare opportunity for all countries to have an equal say in negotiations. The Madrid summit comes 4 years after the 2015 Paris Agreement to limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius. That's 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. But as the summit heads into its final days, representatives from the global south say the United States and other rich countries are obstructing the talks and trying to avoid their obligation to assist poorer countries already facing the worst effects of the climate crisis. We'll be joined in a minute by Harjit Singh, climate change specialist at Action Aid from New Delhi, India. But first, we want to turn to a clip from his speech here at the COP25.
This process was designed to deliver global justice. This is a place where Tuvalu is as powerful as European Union or United States. But the constant bullying of these big countries are making this process worse than useless. Their bullying hasn't stopped. They are not letting us make any progress in this space. There is no substitute for action. And what rich countries are doing, they are creating an illusion of action by just talking. When we demand action, they offer reports. When we demand money, they offer workshops. That is not going to help people who are suffering right now.
Harjit Singh joins us now, along with Asad Rehman, Executive Director of War on Want. He's worked on climate change issues for over a decade. We welcome you both back to Democracy Now! It seems every UN climate summit we get to speak to each of you. Harjit, you were speaking here at the climate summit on Monday. But I think for people to understand around the world what is taking place, especially as in the United States, people understand that the President Trump is pulling the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord, that they may think they have nothing to do with these negotiations. But in fact, isn't it true that they are central to these negotiations?
Absolutely. So at this very moment, what negotiators are discussing is how to deal with climate emergency. And what we call climate emergency on the outside is basically defined as loss and damage as a third pillar of climate action. And this is a very crucial moment where they are putting concrete proposals on the table to help people who are suffering climate crisis. As we sit here, 45 million people in Africa are facing the wrath of climate change. And that is the reality. Women and children are far more vulnerable and are facing food, the starvation situation at this very moment. And the drought that they are facing is worst in 35 years. Now, this system, United Nations system on climate change, is broken, has not been able to help these people. And this particular COP is about creating that system so that money starts flowing in. And United States, which is not yet out of Paris Agreement, so in a way serving the notice period, is obstructing any progress that we could have made here in fixing that broken system. It's not allowing any process that can take us closer to mobilizing money to help people who are facing climate emergency.
According to the climate news source Heated, the United States is circulating a loss and damages proposal here at COP that would make it even more difficult for poorer countries to receive financial support to recover from droughts, floods, and other climate emergencies. What exactly is the U.S. proposing?
The proposal that U.S. is right now only sharing with heads of delegation and not putting it formally is a way to arm twist developing countries that if you want any decision on loss and damage process which can help people, you have to agree that we will continue to have a seat at the table even when we are out of Paris Agreement. And even more worse is that you have to make sure that the liability waiver is extended to United States and its polluting industries. This is worst I have seen in the last 10 years of me attending negotiations. It can't get worse than that. It's arm twisting and bullying at the highest level where United States, which is not meeting its emission targets, is not giving any money to Green Climate Fund and not now even letting a system to be created that can help people who face climate emergency now. I mean, look at the audacity of United States, the way they are behaving in these negotiations.
Earlier this year, Mozambique was struck by two cyclones, Idai and Kenneth. Over 1,000 people were killed, millions displaced. This was the first time in recorded history the country was hit by two powerful tropical cyclones in the same season. Cyclone Kenneth was the strongest storm ever to make landfall in Mozambique. In the wake of Idai, the International Monetary Fund loaned Mozambique $118 million for reconstruction. Sarah Jane Clifton, director of Jubilee Debt Campaign, blasted the international community for forcing Mozambique to borrow money to cope with a disaster brought on by climate change. She told Climate Home News, quote, "What's happening to Mozambique is going to happen to other places more frequently unless there's a more systematic approach for tackling debt problems of poor countries. There's going to be a climate debt trap spiraling out of control." A climate debt trap. Harji, explain.
Absolutely. Let's look at what happens when you are hit by a climate crisis. One incident can wipe out development gains over the last decades. They don't have money to invest into development because all their money gets diverted in providing relief. So they will always, and then they are forced to take loan from the same system that is responsible for the climate crisis. So they will always remain in debt. Poor people will end up repaying that debt that their governments are forced to take because there is no system that exists that recognizes that climate crisis is making it worse for these people who are not even responsible for this emergency situation. And the money that should have gone to education, to health, to better their infrastructure is now going to provide food, is now going to provide relief material and reconstruct their homes over and over again. So these poor countries will never be able to come out of that debt trap that they are put in.
But what does this have to do with the United States? Explain. I mean, In the past, the United States was running all sorts of side panels here. Now there is almost no obvious presence in terms of that to the outside public. But explain what it is they're doing behind the scenes. And then next year, well, I think it's a day after Election Day, the U.S. is formally out. We'll see who'll be the president then, but they won't be president yet, which means next year in Glasgow, COP26, will the U.S. not be present at all? And would you say that's better than what they're doing right now?
Absolutely. Right now, US is in all streams of discussions that are happening, be it finance, be it loss and damage, be it adaptation. They're everywhere. And everywhere they are obstructing and not allowing any progress to happen, and particularly on finance. Now, when we talk about this system that should provide money to climate survivors, they don't want that system to be created. And this demand is not a new demand. Vanuatu, on behalf of small island states, made that demand for the first time in 1991. It took us 22 years to set up a mechanism called Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage in Warsaw in 2013, which had a very clear function to mobilize finance and help these countries. Last 6 years, constant bullying and blocking by United States, joined by Australia and even European Union, did not allow even a group to be created that can discuss what the needs are, what the gap is, how money can be mobilized. And that bullying continues at this very moment. So this year is important. That body, Warsaw International Mechanism, is being reviewed. There is a critical opportunity to relook at whether it is fit for purpose. The disasters that we are facing is because of 1 degree Celsius temperature rise. And we are going towards 3 degrees, which does not mean 3 times the impacts. The impacts are going to be much more. Is this body fit for purpose? Is it able to help people? For people who are suffering climate emergency right now in Mozambique and other parts of Africa? No, it's not. So how do we relook at this body? How do we bring in finance, which is much more needed for these communities? But US is busy protecting the interest of its own administration and polluting industries so that they can never be held liable for the crisis they have caused. And US is the biggest historical emitter, so which means the largest country responsible for this crisis.
Finally, Harjeet, Article 6, explain what this is. I think so often the jargon here prevents people from having access or understanding the very real consequences of climate catastrophe in the world.
So to put it simply, Article 6 is about how to get private sector involved and how markets are going to play in reducing emissions. This is the only piece that is hanging from the Paris rule book that was finalized last year. So the interest of developed countries is mobilize money from private sector in a manner where they don't have to invest money. But from developing countries side, it's really important to see much more public financing coming in, and the rules that are set for private companies are robust enough so that there is no leakage or loopholes. And there is a danger of these emission reduction targets being double counted if we don't put the right rules in place. And there's also a bigger challenge of human rights. You know, today is a Human Rights Day, and we see how these companies have been continuously violating human rights. So we really have to make sure that people's human rights are not violated by these private companies. For them, the sole motive remains making profit. And we have seen how these corporations have ruined the planet, and they always have profit over planet. So it's really important to make sure that the so-called carbon markets or carbon trading is fair.
Asad Rehman, say more about these carbon markets.
So, as you said, often we talk about all of these terms and there's a lot of jargon. So let's break it down very, very simply. Right? We know what the climate scientists have told us. We now see it with our eyes about what's happening around the world, and that's all happening at 1 degree. Climate scientists have told us we can't breach the 1.5 degree guardrail. And they say that there's a certain amount of carbon that's left that we're allowed to pollute. Actually, if you look at the climate science report, it says really there's about 5 years of budget left, right, if you want to prevent that breach. 10 years if we want to be generous. And what's happening here now is rich developed countries, not just the United States, but Australia, Canada, backed by the European Union, not only don't want to cut their own emissions, not only don't want to provide finance that they promise, not only don't want to help the most impacted people, but now want to get out of jail card. And this is what Article 6, the carbon markets, are. Because what it basically says is, I won't have to cut my emissions, but I can pay somebody else and you cut your emissions, and I will count it as if I cut my emissions, as if there is a never-ending magic box of carbon pollution that we're allowed to do. It's not possible. If a country like, for example, the United Kingdom or the United States, their fair share of effort would be at something like -200 by 2030. There is simply no carbon that you can use for an offset. And that's taken away the issue around the environmental integrity. Because 10 years ago, we had an argument in these very negotiations about carbon markets, and developing countries and civil society absolutely rejected them. They said they do not deliver emissions reductions. They lead to huge human rights violations. They allow profit for private companies and nothing to ordinary people. But what's most pernicious here is that as the United States and other developed countries block any progress on the finance conversation, on the help on loss and damage, what they're saying to developing countries is, if you agree to the carbon markets, maybe in there we will give you some share of the profit. And so what developing countries are left with is that is the only thing that's left on the table. They know it won't deliver emissions reductions, they know it will be devastating the planet, but for much needed finance, that's the carrot that's being dangled. It is an absolutely outrageous decision, and ministers, as they are meeting here, will hold developing countries to hostage, because they will say we will only allow conversations about much needed loss and damage if you allow us to have the carbon markets decision go through.
We're going to break, then come back to our discussion. Asad Rehman is Executive Director of War on Want, usually in London. Harjeet Singh, Global Lead on Climate Change at ActionAid, usually in New Delhi, India. When we come back, Asad Rehman will also talk about the explosive Washington Post series on the history of the U.S. war in Afghanistan. And we'll talk more about what's happening here and what's happening in Britain. The elections come up on Thursday there. And, well, we'll find out what's happening. And also, the major players there, the candidates' position on the climate crisis. Stay with us. Witch Hunter by a Stick and a Stone. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting from the UN Climate Summit in Madrid, Spain. I'm Amy Goodman. As we speak, outside the plenary halls of this summit here in Madrid, in the background, we can see the enormous hands of a sculpture pressed against the edifice of a street scene in Venice, Italy. The piece was created by the Italian sculptor Lorenzo Quinn, son of the Oscar-winning actor Anthony Quinn. An inscription at its base reads in part, "Venice, the floating city of art and culture that's inspired humanity for centuries, is threatened by climate change and time decay and is in need of the support of our generation and future ones," unquote. The hands are those of a child, representing Venice's present and future, supporting life and culture. In November, nearly 90% of Venice was flooded amidst high tides and heavy rains, causing over $1 billion worth of damage to historic buildings. Venice's mayor called the flooding apocalyptic and said climate change is to blame. Still with us, Asad Rehman, Executive Director of War on Want, worked on climate change issues for over a decade. Asad, we just finished up with Harjeet and you talking about what's happening here, but I'm wondering if you can talk about what's happening right now in Britain. I hope to come back to you at the end of the week when you'll be in London, because your elections are Thursday. But the significance of what's happening there, what is at stake?
So there's much at stake. I mean, of course, it's a huge election. From a climate-related point of view, it's going to be a big debate about whether the UK adopts what's called now a Green New Deal, with really ambitious targets of trying to reduce our emissions by 2030 or close to by 2030, with a massive investment in terms of new green jobs and tackling austerity and delivering both climate justice for people domestically and also recognising the UK's footprint globally.
Earlier this year, the British House of Commons became the first parliament in the world to declare a climate emergency. This is Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn.
We have no time to waste. We are living in a climate crisis that will spiral dangerously out of control unless we take rapid and dramatic action now. This is no longer about a distant future. We're talking about nothing less than the irreversible destruction of the environment within our lifetimes of members of this House.
The resolution came on the heels of April's Extinction Rebellion uprising in London that saw police arrest more than 1,000 protesters, many of whom superglued themselves to buildings, trains, and sidewalks in a nonviolent direct action campaign. So the position of the Prime Minister now, Boris Johnson, who the two top candidates essentially are Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson.
Yes, it's often now called that we're in a climate election. And to put it starkly, we have environmental organisations who've rated everybody's manifesto. At this moment, they're saying that the Labour Party is the strongest manifesto on tackling the climate crisis. The offer that's been put on the table by the Conservative Party is deemed to be the weakest. It has a much longer target date of net zero by 2050. No real pathways to how we would even achieve that. And put it into context, the UK is important because next year the UK will be the president of the COP as COP26 moves to the UK. So if the UK is showing real climate leadership, it could help unblock the real need for ambition, both in terms of emissions reduction by rich developed countries, but also of countries accepting that they have an obligation to pay their climate finance. And for many of us who've been inside this space, we know that the reality of mobilisations that around the world now, with millions of people out on the street, needs to change our governments at home so that they come here with a mandate to actually adopt action. Otherwise, it feels like Groundhog Day here, where governments continue to talk, but actually offer very, very little action.
And finally, I wanted to just get a quick comment from you. We're going to do this much more extensively in the days to come, but on what many are calling the new Pentagon Papers, the Washington Post, revealing a confidential trove of documents that reveal how senior U.S. officials have lied throughout the 18-year war in Afghanistan, the longest war in U.S. history. The first installation of the explosive report published Monday, headlined "At War with Truth," documenting how U.S. officials repeatedly lied about the war's progress while hiding evidence the war had become unwinnable. It shows how 3 successive presidencies, George W. Bush, President Obama, President Trump, have bungled the war in Afghanistan despite 750,000 U.S. troops there since 2001. The paper's also revealing how U.S. officials tried to hide the truth about the war from the American public. You have long worked on what not only climate issues, and they are connected, but the issue of war. Can you talk about what you have read so far?
Yes, I mean, and it's a damning indictment, and of course it validates what many of us have long said during both the war in Afghanistan, and it's as equally applicable to the military interventions that have taken place in Iraq and Libya. We've always said that actually the $1 trillion that, for example, has been spent on this misguided war would not deliver any progress for the people of Afghanistan, and the fact that the military and the government lied to their own people and said actually progress was being made, and it's absolutely shocking. ground. The reality on the ground, as we know, is Afghanistan is still a more dangerous place. This is not genuine peace building. Peace building does not come at the barrel of a gun, and democracy does not come at the barrel of the gun. If the governments were serious about wanting to tackle the military conflicts, their first step would be to stop selling the arms and weapons that fuel these conflicts. The second would be stop supporting military dictatorships and these regimes which commit human rights violations. And thirdly would have been to actually support the Afghan people and their genuine peace-building movements that were existing there. It did none of those things, and it's leaving Afghanistan in a much more horrific and a much more broken place than it was.
Well, we will certainly continue to cover this explosive series, and we'll link to it at democracynow.org. Asad Rehman, Executive Director of War on Want, thank you so much for joining us. When we come back, we look at indigenous resistance here at the UN Climate Conference, from pipeline politics to the Amazon. Stay with us.
Tú nos dices que debemos sentarnos, pero las ideas solo pueden levantarnos, caminar, correr, no rendirse ni retroceder, ver, aprender como esponja absorbe. Nadie sobre todos, faltan todos, suman todos para todos, todo para nosotros. Soñamos en grande que se caiga el imperio, lo gritamos alto, no queda más remedio. Esto no es utopía, es alegre rebeldía del baile de los que sobran de la danza de mi mía. Levantarnos para decir ya basta, ni África ni América Latina se suba. Con barro, con casco, con lápiz a patear el fiasco, provocar un social terremoto en este charco.
We are South by Anna Tijoux. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from inside the UN Climate Change Conference, the UN Climate Summit here in Madrid, Spain. I'm Amy Goodman. On Monday, indigenous activists from the Brazilian and Ecuadorian Amazon rallied outside this COP25 venue to protest the assassination of indigenous forest protectors and the destruction of their lands, known as the lungs of the earth. Their protest came just 2 days after two indigenous chiefs, Firmino Prechedi Guajajara and Raimundo Guajajara, were gunned down in a drive-by shooting Saturday in Brazil.
I am Leo Cerda from the indigenous community of Serena in the Ecuadorian Amazon. I am here to support the Brazilian delegation that is denouncing the deaths of two indigenous people that just passed away on Saturday due to the policies that Bolsonaro is pursuing in Brazil. We are here denouncing the policies because Bolsonaro is not only bad for Brazil, Bolsonaro is bad for the whole world.
I'm Diana Tucano from the Tucano people from Brazil, in the border between Brazil, Colombia, and Venezuela, and we are here at the climate conference with the Extinction Rebellion Group and many other climate justice movements, pleading for the survival and the support to indigenous peoples that are the guardians of the forest and are the first ones to be attacked in this moment of genocide and ecocide that we are living. Brazil is one of the countries that kills the most of nature protectors and climate activists in the world, and many of them are indigenous nations because our territories are those that protect more than 80% of biodiversity in the world.
My name is Helena Golinga. I'm 17 years old and I'm from the Ecuadorian Amazon. So my community has been fighting oil since forever, as long as I can remember. And I grew up during this process fight, and my people has been fighting this for such a long time, and that has made me part of this movement. And I think that it's my responsibility as a young person and as an indigenous youth to make the people of the Amazon, their voices heard in spaces like this.
Tell me, can you hear us? Stronger by the hour. Getting stronger by the hour. Power! Power! People!
Could you explain what's happening
happening right now?
We just finished the press conference and we're going to take action now. We're doing a civil disobedience with the groups from the north and the south.
Here you can see there's two lines of activists from Extinction Rebellion from the global north, and they have said that they're putting their bodies on the line, that they're risking arrest in order to be in solidarity with Indigenous people who put their bodies on the line every day. We spoke to many of these Extinction Rebellion activists earlier while they were blocking the road right next to the press conference of these Brazilian Indigenous activists.
My name is Elaine. I'm from Extinction Rebellion Belgium. We are now in front of the COP25 where it is all happening, sitting down on the road, blocking the traffic. That's what we are doing, especially to support the Indigenous people in the Amazon that are suffering a lot from the way that we live, that we all live, and that needs to change.
I'm Alberto. I'm from Venice, and we are fighting for life, literally, because we are seeing that biodiversity is being lost in we are losing more than 200 species of animals and plants every day, and the risk is that the next ones will be us.
I'm Alex. I'm from California. We are here sacrificing our bodies as the bodies of Indigenous people have been sacrificed and abused for centuries. It's our turn to take a sacrifice. It's what everyone needs to do.
I'm Kay. I'm from the UK, and we're blocking this road to support the Indigenous people, and I'm personally doing it for my children. Because this is our last chance now. This is our last chance, and we need to stand up for these people and those people who died in the Amazon, and for our children.
And how old are your children?
My children are 4 and 6 years old, and I want them to have a future on this planet, and I want it to be livable for them.
We're right behind us. We see a delegation from the Brazilian Amazon who have come to denounce the killings of Brazilian activists and leaders, particularly Indigenous Brazilian activists and leaders. In the center, you can see Sonia. She's a relative of 2 Indigenous activists from Brazil who were murdered this weekend on Saturday as they were coming back from a meeting of the electrical company and the Indigenous Federation demanding their rights as Indigenous people.
Eu sou a Sônia Guajajara, sou do estado do
I am from the state of Maranhão in Brazil. I am the executive director of the Indigenous Peoples Articulation of Brazil. In Brazil, at the moment, it's very hard to live as an indigenous person. For the legal certification of logging, mining, and agro businesses that are destroying the Amazon. In 35 days, there have been 3 killings. This is a direct result of Bolsonaro's direct policies that are threatening the indigenous lives in Brazil.
3 of your family members have already been murdered. Are you afraid for your own life?
O governo Bolsonaro é governo sim.
The Bolsonaro's government is threatening all of us. All of our lives are at risk right now. But that doesn't mean that we will stop fighting and fighting for the lives of our people.
And that was Sonia Guajajara, Indigenous leader from Brazil, whose 2 relatives were assassinated on Saturday. This is Democracy Now! We're broadcasting from Madrid, Spain at the UN Climate Summit. Indigenous people from Canada and the United States are speaking out against extraction, pipeline projects, the environmental devastation of their territories at this summit. On Monday, Rose Whipple, a member of the Santi, Dakota, and Ho-Chunk, and youth delegate from Sustain Us, spoke on a panel of youth climate activists.
I remember the sunshine on my skin as I stood at the headwaters of the Mississippi River, the drinking source for over 18 million humans. Here in Minnesota, I joined other Indigenous youth to prepare for our month-long canoe journey through our stolen ancestral homelands. We paddled to raise awareness of the Line 3 tar sands oil pipeline that threatens to devastate our communities. We dipped our cupped hands in the river, sipping the clean water. This is the same sacred river where my Dakota ancestors have been harvesting our sacred manumin for thousands of years. This river is important and sacred, not only to my ancestors, but for my people still to this day. We happily canoed down this river for weeks, smiling and laughing, sharing our dreams for a fossil fuel world. Soon after, everything changed. Things were darker. The sky, the water, the air. Our group came underneath the shadow of a factory looming over our lands like a nightmare. Our sacred waters were sick, our hope melting into despair, and it was then that we took action. In a historic case against the pipeline, we came together as youth to intervene with 5 other tribes to fight for justice. Although we fought for our river, begged them to leave our waters and lands alone, to say no to the Line 3 pipeline, it wasn't enough. The pipeline was unanimously approved. We have been fighting these extractive projects through the US court system, but this colonial institution continuously values corporate profit over indigenous lives. Today, this injustice and my hope are the fires that have brought me to this room. Hamitakiapi, Rose Whippulamaki Santi Hamataha. Hello, my relatives. My name is Rose Whipple, and I'm 18 years old. I am attending these global negotiations with the first ever Sustainus Indigenous Youth Delegation from the United States. We're here to share these stories, to share our prayers, and bring a frontline fight to the halls of the United Nations. Our people come from many different lands, waters, and cultures. Yet each of us are here together, calling on the strength of our ancestors to remind us of our commitments to future generations. Our movements for the protection of our sacred sites and lands sound like Protect Mauna Kea, No Shasta Dam Raise in California, Stand with Bears Ears in Utah, and Demilitarize Guam. Our movements for our waters sound like Stop Jordan Cove in Oregon, Save Bristol Bay in Alaska, No Keystone XL pipeline, and no DAPL expansion across the Great Plains, and especially no Line 3 pipeline in Minnesota. The climate crisis is more than a discussion about a 1.5 degrees Celsius. It also looks like stolen and caged children at the US-Mexico border. It looks like missing and murdered indigenous women. People are dying. Indigenous land defenders are being murdered. The climate crisis is a spiritual crisis for our entire world. Our solutions must weave science with spirituality and traditional ecological knowledge with technology. Our movements must be bigger than recycling and braver than holding signs. It is up to each and every one of us to build movements that center the rights of indigenous peoples, healing and justice for the next 7 generations. It is time for us all to reconnect with Mother Earth. It is time to remember how to listen to her, to guide our climate solutions. Destroy white supremacy.
As U.S. Indigenous activist Rose Whipple addressed reporters at the UN Climate Summit on Monday in an Indigenous youth panel, elders gathered outside, as well as Indigenous youth, of the Canadian embassy here in Madrid, Spain, to protest the Canadian government's support of the Alberta tar sands extraction and new fossil fuel infrastructure, including a pipeline that would cut through Indigenous lands to carry tar sands oil from Alberta to Wisconsin in the United States. We're joined now by one of those demonstrators, Ariel Dranger. She's a member of the Athabasca Chippewayan First Nation and the executive director of Indigenous Climate Action. Ariel, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. So we just heard Rose, a young Indigenous activist who lives in St. Paul in Minnesota, talking about the map of the pipelines and what crisscrosses Indigenous land. Take us from there to Canada.
So right now what's happening is there is a series of pipelines being built. I come from a territory in northern Alberta, Treaty 8 territory, in a community called Fort Chipewyan. So if you are looking at Wisconsin to Fort Chipewyan, there's hundreds and hundreds of miles or kilometers, whichever you prefer. But we have pipeline corridors that are running from our community in south of Fort Chipewyan in the heart of the extraction zone, just north of Fort McMurray, going southward down into Edmonton, Alberta, where we have hubs of pipeline corridors that are shooting out to the west coast of Canada, to the eastern Canada and United States, and down through the south into the United States as well. So we have pipeline corridors that are going coast to coast to coast of the continent of North America, traversing over critical waterways through the Indigenous territories of multiple Indigenous nations across Canada and the United States, where these pipelines are now delivering oil to refineries and upgraders, where they're being processed outside of low-income people of color and Indigenous communities, further exacerbating the pollution as well as the emissions that those communities are faced with at the source.
So I went to the Cumbre the other day, the Alternative Climate Summit, and you and other Indigenous youth from Canada were really focusing on the tech frontier mine, which might sound to people in the U.S. like Silicon Valley, the tech frontier mine. But explain more what that is and the kind of cross-border organizing that you're doing.
Right now, what's happening is there's a company called Teck Resources. They're not a tech firm, but rather they've been a mineral hard rock company. So they've been a mining company, mainly working in coal. They actually have a tremendous human rights abuse record. They're not a very good company, but this is their first foray into the oil sands or the tar sands. And they're proposing the largest ever tar sands mine. This project will be 29,000 hectares of land, bigger than the city of Vancouver, twice the size of the center of Vancouver or the size of Metro Vancouver. This project will produce close to 260,000 barrels of oil a day. It will also create 6 megatons of emissions and crisscross over the habitat of bison, caribou, moose, lynx, muskrat, as well as the last remaining wild flock of whooping cranes, and be adjacent to the river system that is the heart of my own community, and 17 kilometers from the boundary of one of our settlements, as well as 30 kilometers just south of a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the Wood Buffalo National Park.
Now, people may think that the Canadian government takes a more enlightened view when it comes to Indigenous people than in the United States, but explain what the Canadian government is doing. What you're demanding as you were outside the Canadian Embassy yesterday here in Madrid, but also to take it home to right here. We're in the heart of the UN Climate Summit, and what you're demanding here. We're right outside the plenary, which I guess they're now having a concert, I guess.
Well, you know, I think the big issue is Canada comes to these meetings touting themselves as a global leader in addressing the climate crisis, as having great relations with their Indigenous peoples. But the reality is in Alberta, in my territory of Treaty 8, not a single project that has ever been proposed in the Alberta tar sands has ever been denied. Even this project being proposed by Teck Resources, the Frontier Mine, largest mine ever, it went through the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency review process. It clearly indicated that it will have irreversible impacts on the environment, on ecosystems, and Indigenous rights. Yet the project was deemed in the public's interest. It's who is the public if Indigenous peoples aren't included in that? Which brings us right back to here we are in COP Madrid, where we're having conversations about inclusion of human rights within Article 6, which is a market-based and non-market-based mechanism for reducing our emissions, where we're arguing whether or not to include human rights and definitely having even more critical challenges, including the rights of Indigenous peoples. But the rights of Indigenous peoples are critical to addressing these issues because, as we've seen in Canada, the rights of Indigenous peoples are not even considered part of the public's rights. We have to demand better safeguards and protections for our people, and we absolutely can't be advocating for more carbon markets.
Clearly, we have to have more of a discussion. We're going to do that in part 2. Post it online at democracynow.org. Ariel Deranger, member of the Athabasca Chippewayan First Nation, Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action in Canada. This final news headline, the Ethiopian Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, is receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo, Norway today. It's International Human Rights Day. But the Prime Minister will not take questions from reporters before or after the ceremony, and he's facing increasing criticism at home in Ethiopia for the government's crackdown against protests in October, in which over 60 people were killed. And that does it for our broadcast. A very happy belated birthday to our very own senior producer, Carla Wills. Democracy Now!, produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzdar, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Libby Rainey, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Masood, Trina Nadura, Tay Maria Studio, Adriana Contreras, Maria Taracena, Dennis Moynihan. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.